If you ever find yourself feeling a bit overwhelmed by the sheer range of possibilities open to us and the number of different presentation styles and genres in which oral language is a central player, then go back to the learning outcomes. Because if you find yourself asking, what is it exactly that we want our students to learn, this is where you're going to find your answer. So you've got them on page 12 of the English specification, and that's in the resource pack that you were given last year, or you can access them on curriculumonline.ie. Before we look at individual learning outcomes, there are a couple of things worth saying in general about working with them. The first is that we integrate the three strands of oral language, reading and writing in our teaching in our classrooms. And an example might help here. So let's say my students are actively listening to a speech, and then they might make notes on specific elements of the speech that I asked them to look out for. So now they're writing as well as listening. And then they might read a transcript of that same speech to examine how it's structured. So they're reading now, and then they might have a discussion of what they've read. And the next step might be to think about writing a response to the speech, and then maybe about writing their own speech. So even though oral language is the focus of this unit, they will read and write and listen and speak when they're engaging with this oral text across a number of classes or lessons. So that's what we mean when we talk about integrating the three strands in our teaching. The second thing that's worth noticing is that the learning outcomes are intended to be a spiral, not a checklist. So students are building up their skills and confidence each time they revisit a particular learning outcome. I'm thinking, for example, of learning outcome number 5, where it's asking students to deliver a short oral text alone or in collaboration with others. So, for example, all of your students might learn how to recite a poem by Christmas of first year. And later on in the year, in the second term, maybe they'll take part in a public speaking competition. At the beginning of second year, they might deliver spoken word film reviews and so on. And each time they revisit learning outcome number 5 to deliver a short oral text alone or in collaboration with others, they're building up their learning and developing their skills in this area. And they need lots of opportunities to do this, both formally and informally, across the 3 years of junior cycle. It's also worth saying that simply practicing a skill over and over again doesn't necessarily make you any better at it unless you work on your technique, unless you know what you're doing well and what you need to work on. So lots of feedback on how to improve is important for students to make progress. The third thing worth saying is that learning outcomes are a good way for us as teachers to self-assess our teaching. So to paraphrase Thomas Kinsella, if I look plainly in the mirror of my teaching soul, I can look at the learning outcomes. I can name and own and be proud of certain elements in my teaching that I know are going well and that I know are working well for my students. But I can also look for and find gaps in my teaching, areas where I would like to develop certain things more with my students in my teaching and in my classroom. So those are a couple of general things to consider when we think about working with learning outcomes. And now we're going to take a closer look at the specific oral language learning outcomes from the specification. There are 13 of them, and you'll see that some of them group together quite naturally because they have certain things in common. So the focus on purpose and audience, who you're speaking to and why you're speaking, is clear in learning outcomes 1 and 7. To know and use the conventions of oral language interaction in a variety of contexts for a range of purposes is there in number 1. And to choose appropriate language style and visual content for specific audiences and chosen purposes, and there's a few examples given there, is there in number 7. The importance of studying oral texts as oral texts, listening to them, not simply reading written transcripts of them, is contained in learning outcomes 6 and 9. So we want students to have opportunities to learn from and evaluate models of oral language use to enrich their own speaking. And we also want to give them opportunities to apply what they've learned about the effectiveness of spoken texts to their own use of oral language. And this builds naturally into learning outcome number 5, where we give students opportunities to deliver a short oral text alone or in collaboration with others. The emphasis on language and taking care with language and tuning into our word choice and register is contained in Learning Outcomes 12 and 13. So we want students to be able to demonstrate how register varies with context and purpose in spoken texts. And we want them to develop their own spoken language proficiency, their own speaking skills, by giving them opportunities to experiment with their word choice and to be precise or to be creative or to tune their language to particular contexts for particular purposes. So you can see there's quite a bit of overlap going on here, but each one has a slightly different focus. Each learning outcome has a slightly different focus. Learning outcome 11 is one that I love because it speaks about how important it is to enjoy listening to a great speaker or listening to a great performer, to engage with the world of oral language use as a pleasurable and purposeful activity, to enjoy chatting to other people to figure things out. But also for whenever students engage with an oral text or engage with each other and speak to each other, that they have a strong sense of purpose. What are we doing and why are we doing this? The need for students to develop listening skills and to actively listen is contained in Learning Outcomes 4 and 8. So they might listen actively just to get the general gist of a presentation or an account, and they could note down in general what's the point, what's the purpose of this oral text. But then we also want them to deepen their learning. We want to give them opportunities to listen actively for more complex reasons. Maybe they're interpreting meaning, comparing two different texts, evaluating how effective a text is, responding to various different genres, and in a systematic way looking at how language works differently for different reasons, for different purposes. Working with others then is the focus of Learning Outcomes 3, 10 and 2, where students should have opportunities to chat to each other about their own work and about other students' work. And if we want them to engage in extended, constructive discussion of each other's work to peer assess in a meaningful way, then we're going to have to patiently teach them those skills, and that is not easy. We also want to give them opportunities to collaborate with each other, to explore ideas, to discuss their understanding of texts, possibly even to create texts with each other. And we also want students to engage in class groups and to do that actively and responsibly. So again, working in groups, working as groups, it's not an easy skill, but it is something that they need to learn, that we all need to learn, I guess. And then to have opportunities to express their feelings, to express their ideas, to recount their own experiences, so that they learn to trust their own voice, their own interpretation of things, and not always look to somebody else for what they might perceive to be the right answer. So that's a quick tour of the learning outcomes. And one more thing before we move on is to remember that, as I mentioned earlier, there may be an audio-visual element in the final exam for English. So either they have to listen to something or they have to watch and listen to something. And the implication of that for us, I guess, is that the knowledge and skills that our students develop across these learning outcomes, across first, second and third year, it remains relevant throughout their junior cycle. That knowledge and those skills, they don't stop being relevant simply because the student has completed their oral communication task. And obviously, developing those skills has a hugely positive impact on their learning, and it's hugely beneficial to them when they move on into senior cycle to study, what is a quite challenging senior cycle English curriculum. So now we're going to take a quick look at 5 pieces of advice for embedding oral language in your planning and in your teaching. The first piece of advice is just to ensure that students have opportunities to study oral texts as oral texts, rather than simply studying written transcripts of spoken word events. We want them to actively listen to them, to tune into tone of voice, volume, pace, expression, etc. And also to think about the content, the sequence, the structure, the register, look at how language changes depending on who they're talking to, what they're talking about, etc. The second piece of advice, you're probably weary of me saying this now, but that's to integrate the 3 strands in our teaching, because it would be just such a shame. We don't want a scenario where oral language is often a box on its own, artificially separated out from everything else in our heads. We talk about things, we discuss things, we read them, we write about them, we take notes, we talk about them again, we ask people for their opinion. Those three strands are interwoven throughout in our teaching and in our classrooms. The third piece of advice is to think about how you can build on the 6th class of experience. So remember, when our students come into us in first year of post-primary school, they've been used to speaking, they've been used to oral language being a key part of the English curriculum in primary school. And if you want to know exactly what they've been up to, I guess it would be really useful maybe to have a chat with one or two of the 6th class English teachers in your local area to ask them what do they do in oral language development. And how can you build on that? Because when our students come into us in first year, initially they may be quite shy, but a lot of them lose some of that shyness as they get used to post-primary school and as they get to know each other. And we can tap into that in our classrooms, hopefully, and then build upon what they did in 6th class across the 3 years of junior cycle in oral language. The fourth piece of advice is to embed oral assessments in our planning, because if we don't, they might fall down our list of priorities, and they also might not be seen as a priority by our own students either. How can we do this? Well, we can do it informally, in our classrooms, in our individual class teaching. So when students are working in pairs or groups, we can assess how well they're communicating and give them feedback. We can explicitly show them how to structure their talk. We can assess their response to a listening exercise. We can get them to peer assess each other. And we can also embed oral assessments in a more formal way. So as a department, you might decide on specific moments across first, second and third year where as a department you're going to include oral elements, be it an oral test or an oral speaking opportunity, in students' Christmas and summer tests and reports. And the fifth piece of advice is to make the invisible process visible to students. What we mean by that is that once you're a good speaker, a lot of what you do becomes invisible to yourself. You can't really see it clearly. But if we gave students, for example, the speaking frames that I mentioned earlier, we're giving them a frame to hang their ideas upon. At first I thought X because, then I realised Y when I heard Z, and in the end I decided ABC. And those speaking frames give students an opportunity to step through their thoughts one at a time and to develop each idea fully in a logical sequence. And those of us who do that naturally, it's invisible to us. We often can't even see it anymore. So if we think about what it is that we do to speak well and try and make what is invisible about that visible to our students. A couple of more examples that occur to me would be, for example, a speaker who uses cue cards with bullet points on them to keep track of what it is that they want to say. It might be where you have a script to help you stay on track, and maybe you insert pauses in your script, maybe you underline words that you particularly want to emphasize when you're speaking. So showing our students how to annotate a script that they're then going to speak aloud, that would be another way of making the invisible visible to them. And another way is, as teachers, we can model good speaking, and most teachers are excellent public speakers, but we can also talk them through our thought processes. So a good example would be when I, as a teacher, read a poem aloud. Obviously, I follow the run-on lines in the poem and I follow the punctuation of the poem to decide when to pause, when to take a break, when to stop. I don't read left to right, left to right, left to right as the poem goes down the page. But unless I make that visible to my students, they might not necessarily know how to read a poem aloud as it's intended to be read aloud. So those are just a couple of ideas and a couple of pieces of advice for dealing with learning outcomes for oral language and embedding oral language in your planning and in your teaching.